annexing Canada. The former central banker later travelled to London to meet Canada's head of state, King Charles, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. James Vazina.
National trip. It's a quick visit, but jam-packed to strengthen Canada's ties with two of its closest allies, France and the United Kingdom.
And Canada's new Prime Minister, Mark Carney, used his first official overseas trip to meet with the leaders of Britain and France, seeking support from old allies as relations with the U.S. sour.
Under Mark Carney's leadership, Canada has begun to rewrite its diplomatic playbook. Carney's first overseas trip wasn't to the United States, as one might expect from a country that has traditionally aligned itself closely with Washington. Instead, he headed to Paris and London, making a deliberate move to forge new alliances with Europe's key powers, France and the UK. This was not simply a diplomatic gesture. It was a clear signal to the world that Canada was charting a new course. The US, which has long been Canada's largest trading partner and closest ally, was no longer the only partner in Canada's international strategy. Carney made it clear that Canada was no longer willing to put all its eggs in the American basket. In 2023, Canada's exports to the US accounted for about 75% of its total exports, making it the country's largest trading partner by a wide margin. However, as trade tensions with the US escalated, Carney's government began looking to Europe and Asia to reduce Canada's dependency on the US market. Carney's decision to prioritize Europe for his first trip speaks volumes. His government has made it known that it will no longer accept unilateral impositions from Washington, especially in light of the Trump tariffs that have created tensions between the two nations. Instead, Carney is positioning Canada as a global player, one that can engage with a wider range of partners across the world, and not just be dictated to by the US. The first step in this new direction was engaging with European powers that have long shared common values, history, and economic ties with Canada. Meetings in Paris with French President Emmanuel Macron and in London with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer were pivotal. These meetings were not mere diplomatic courtesies. They were about reinforcing shared strategic goals. Carney's engagement with Macron and Starmer emphasized the importance of diversifying Canada's foreign relationships, especially in trade, defense, and technology. Carney's first diplomatic trip to Paris and London was a bold move that demonstrated Canada's shift away from exclusive dependence on the US. He is sending the message loud and clear. Canada is open to new relationships, and it won't be confined to the US orbit any longer. The diplomatic meetings between Mark Carney and European leaders were far more than symbolic. These talks were focused on practical, strategic partnerships that would strengthen Canada's economic and defense position in the global arena. Carney's meetings in Paris were centered around building stronger economic and defense ties with France, while in London, the discussions revolved around further strengthening financial ties and finding ways to expand trade partnerships. The UK especially is eager to secure strong trading partners post-Brexit, and Canada, as an economically robust and politically stable nation, is the ideal partner for these ambitions. According to Eurostat, Canada is the EU's 10th largest trading partner, and in 2022, Canada exported over 36 billion Canadian dollars in goods to the EU. With the UK now outside the EU, it too is eager to build trade relations with countries like Canada. In Paris, Carney engaged in discussions with President Macron on joint defense projects, including future collaboration in defense technology. The significance of these talks cannot be overstated, as they signal that Canada is open to pursuing defense partnerships with European countries, not just relying on US-based projects like the F-35 fighter jet program. Macron even proposed the idea of establishing joint working groups between France and Canada to explore cooperation on defense and technology, a move that could shake up the traditional dynamics within NATO. On the economic front, Carney emphasized the need for Canada to diversify its energy exports. Historically, Canada's energy sector has been heavily reliant on US demand for oil and natural gas. But Carney is now working to open up new markets for Canadian energy in Europe and Asia. As the EU seeks to reduce its dependency on Russian energy, Canada's vast natural resources position it as an ideal supplier to meet Europe's growing energy needs. In 2023, Canada exported $130 billion worth of crude oil to the US, accounting for 98% of Canada's total oil exports. However, with growing tensions and the EU's desire to diversify energy sources, Canada sees an opportunity to expand its LNG exports to Europe, reducing the continent's reliance on Russia. Carney's diplomatic efforts in Paris and London are about securing independent defense and economic alliances outside of the US. Through these strategic partnerships, Canada is not just looking to trade goods, but to ensure that it has a strong, independent military and economic footing in a multipolar world. One of the most contentious issues driving the rift between Canada and the US is the debate surrounding the F-35 fighter jet program. The F-35 has long been considered a pillar of the US-Canada military partnership, a symbol of shared defense interests and NATO collaboration. However, recent revelations about a potential kill switch feature embedded in the F-35 software have raised alarms in Canada about its security sovereignty. The F-35, developed with the cooperation of several NATO allies, is a next-generation fighter jet designed to enhance the military capabilities of the US and its closest partners. However, the US has a critical advantage. It controls the software that powers the jet. This has led to the rumors of a kill switch, a feature that could allow the US to disable key functions of the aircraft remotely. For Canada, this raises a fundamental question about control over its own defense capabilities. The F-35 program has already cost over $1.7 trillion globally, and Canada is a key buyer, with the country planning to spend $13 billion on 88 fighter jets as part of the F-35 program. However, the kill switch issue has created major concerns within Ottawa, especially with questions about the sovereignty of defense systems. Why should Canada continue investing billions in a military asset that could be compromised by the country that controls its software? If the US can disable the F-35 at will, especially during a diplomatic or military conflict, it raises grave concerns about Canada's ability to defend itself independently. Carney's government has been particularly vocal about these concerns. In statements to the press, Carney has expressed that Canada cannot afford to be dependent on a defense system that it does not fully control. With the F-35 at the center of this debate, Carney's administration is weighing the possibility of canceling the purchase of these jets and seeking alternative defense technologies from European nations, including France and Germany. The kill switch controversy has become a flashpoint in the growing tensions between Canada and the US. For Carney, it's a clear sign that Canada must seek a more independent defense strategy, one that does not hinge on the whims of a single nation, no matter how close the relationship may have been in the past. The F-35 kill switch controversy symbolizes the growing unease in Canada regarding its reliance on the US for defense technology. The possibility of Canada canceling the F-35 project would send a stark message about the limits of Canada's relationship with the US, signaling a shift towards European defense partnerships. The trade war between Canada and the US has reached a new level of tension under the Trump administration's protectionist policies. The US tariffs on Canadian steel, aluminum, and automotive products, along with new quotas on agricultural products, have deeply affected the Canadian economy. The US is a critical trading partner, but Carney's government has made it clear that Canada will not be coerced into accepting these policies. Canada's response to these trade restrictions has been one of resilience and adaptation. Mark Carney has wasted no time in pursuing alternative trade routes that would reduce Canada's dependence on the US market. In addition to expanding its relationships with Europe and Asia, Carney is accelerating efforts to diversify Canada's energy exports. Canada's vast energy resources, including oil and natural gas, have long been essential to the US economy. But now, with the EU looking to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, Canada is stepping in to fill the void and establish itself as a key energy supplier to Europe. In 2023, Canada's trade with the US totaled $653.8 billion, representing about 75% of Canada's overall exports. With increasing trade barriers and tariffs from the US, Carney's administration has ramped up efforts to diversify. In 2022, Canada's exports to the EU reached $15.7 billion in goods, with energy exports to Europe showing a significant uptick as European countries seek alternatives to Russian oil and gas. This economic diversification is a key component of Carney's foreign policy. Canada is no longer willing to be beholden to U.S. tariffs or trade impositions. Instead, the country is actively exploring new markets and seeking mutually beneficial trade agreements with countries across the globe. The UK, post-Brexit, is particularly interested in securing new trade deals with countries like Canada, and France is looking for energy suppliers to reduce its dependency on Russian oil and gas. Canada's plan to shift trade relations away from the US is already underway, with Carney's government having engaged in talks with European powers and Asian markets. This shift is a direct response to the unilateral actions taken by the US and marks a new chapter in Canada's economic future. Canada's response to US trade restrictions has been swift and strategic, as Carney pursues alternative trade avenues in Europe and Asia, ensuring that Canada is no longer at the mercy of US tariffs or trade impositions. Canada's economy has long been dominated by its trade relationship with the United States, which accounts for approximately 75% of Canadian exports. However, the Trump-era tariffs and the shifting global economic environment have prompted Prime Minister Carney to rethink the country's economic strategy. One significant policy initiative that Carney's government is moving forward with is the removal of internal trade barriers within Canada. Currently, the country's provinces and territories face barriers to trade, including differences in regulations, taxes, and licensing requirements that hinder the free flow of goods and services across provincial lines. Prime Minister Carney's goal is clear. He wants to create a free internal trade system within Canada by July 1st, 2025. This ambitious deadline aims to eliminate the economic friction caused by such barriers, allowing businesses to operate with greater efficiency and less bureaucratic delay. A 2023 study showed that reducing internal trade barriers could increase Canada's GDP by 2 to 4% over the next decade. It would also lead to significant cost savings for businesses, particularly in the resource and manufacturing sectors, which face the brunt of regulatory fragmentation. The rationale behind these reforms is clear. Carney seeks to make Canada less vulnerable to external economic pressures, particularly from the US, by unlocking the full potential of its internal market. This plan would allow goods, services, and resources to flow more freely across the provinces and territories, fostering greater economic integration within Canada. The plan is expected to reduce trade costs, increase interprovincial investments, and make Canadian businesses more competitive globally. Carney's push for free internal trade is a strategic move to shield the Canadian economy from external shocks like US tariffs, while also boosting productivity and creating a more unified national market. While Carney focuses on the country's internal economic reforms, he is also facing intense opposition over another critical issue: the federal carbon price system. The carbon pricing system, which taxes companies for their carbon emissions, is part of Canada's effort to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions and meet its climate targets. However, it has become a flashpoint for political debate, especially within the oil and gas industry. Opposition parties and oil executives have called for the scrapping of the federal carbon price, arguing that it is an unnecessary burden on Canada's energy sector and will make Canadian companies less competitive in the global market, particularly against US competitors who benefit from lower environmental regulations. In 2022, the federal carbon price was set at $50 per ton, and it is scheduled to rise to $65 per ton by 2025, with the possibility of reaching $170 per ton by 2030. This escalating cost is expected to significantly impact high-emission industries like oil, gas, and manufacturing, which are crucial to the Canadian economy. The carbon pricing debate has drawn sharp divisions, with proponents arguing that it is a necessary tool to combat climate change and push Canada toward a greener economy. However, oil industry executives have voiced strong opposition, warning that such a pricing system could lead to job losses and hurt Canada's ability to compete globally. Prime Minister Carney has been firm in his stance that Canada must balance environmental goals with economic growth. While he remains committed to reducing emissions, Carney has also acknowledged that there needs to be a strategy in place to support the oil and gas sector through the transition to a low-carbon economy. Investments in green technologies and the creation of clean energy jobs will be key to ensuring that Canada can maintain economic growth without compromising on environmental commitments. The carbon price system remains a major area of contention, with industries like oil and gas strongly opposing the federal tax, while Carney defends it as essential for meeting Canada's climate targets. The challenge for his government will be to mitigate the economic impact on vulnerable sectors while advancing the climate agenda. The story of Canada's changing relationship with the U.S. is just beginning. With Mark Carney's bold diplomatic moves, Canada's push towards Europe, and growing concerns about defense sovereignty, the future of U.S.-Canada relations will look vastly different from what we've known in the past. The question now is, will the U.S. embrace the changing reality of its relationship with Canada, or will it continue to pressure its neighbor into submission? Stay tuned as we continue to monitor this evolving situation and bring you the latest developments.